Like you said, the way we have structured kind of our formats for our midweek seminars is that we take the entirety of the semester. We did the exact same thing with True North. We give the entire seminar, so that means the entirety of the semester, 3 months. The spring one is actually a combination of winter and spring. We go January to just a little bit into May. In the fall, we do September, October, November, and then we end midweek officially. The Wednesday before Thanksgiving is our last midweek, and the reason we do that intentionally is because we put so much time and energy. We put all of our eggs into our baskets for Christmas into our Sunday morning and Christmas Eve services. We make the entire month a single theme, and there's set construction, set design. If you can believe it, we are already off to the races in set construction. The teachings, the messages, the music, and there's so much energy that goes into us pulling together that Christmas season for the month of December that we just take midweek off because we use those weeks in the middle, especially in the middle of the weeks, to prepare for each of those Sunday services. So we always make this encouragement, and this is the season. You'll see here in just a couple of weeks, we'll have the initial artwork displayed, the initial advertising display. We will have the floor display. Kind of kiosk thing between the doors. We'll have invite cards. The amount of energy that we put into Christmas, this is a phenomenal time that if you have friends, colleagues, whatever the case is, that you would say, I'm looking for an opportunity to invite them, I just don't know when. Christmas is it. I mean, that's a season where we don't go soft on the messages, but it's something where people understand that Christmas is a season and a time to be in church, and so that's a time to invite. I already have a list of 3 or 4 people that I know. They've never darkened the doors of a church that I know of in their entire life, and they're people I'm going to take invite cards, and so you'll see all that taking place here, and you'll see some of that happening. But the way in which we structure the seminars is we break it into classes, so we're still inside of the missing the mark kind of theme in the seminar, but tonight we kind of pivot. We're a little bit later because somebody got sick, not sure who. But because of the sickness that went around and the sickness that took place, we're actually a week behind. But the second session of this, the first session, was that we talked about the seriousness of sin. We said that as Christians, for our Christian walk, we need to understand what sin is. And I use the illustration that because we're a beach community, we get this. You go to the beach, you'll see signs, avoid rip currents, avoid rip currents, avoid rip currents. You'll hear National Weather Service warnings put out over the radio. You'll see them over your phone. If you have any kind of a weather app, you've probably seen AccuWeather or other things. They'll post things for us in our area that say, dangerous surf warnings, rip currents are strong today. And I've said this before, that if you don't know what a rip current is, you can't avoid it. And it's the same with sin. So we've gone through that first session on the seriousness of sin, which was 5 parts, where we talked about that as Christians, the reason we're studying sin, we're not glorifying it, we're not trying to call undue attention to it, we're simply saying that we should understand how the Scriptures define it, what it is, and ultimately because we want to be people that walk and avoid that, make sure our aim is true. The second class that we're starting tonight is entitled The Subtlety of Sin. The subtlety of sin, on just how subtle and how devious and how sin sometimes without us even knowing it, we get tripped up by it, we step into it. And the way I want to approach it is I want to use social media. The goal is not to just bash on social media. The goal is not to have everybody in our church, kill their accounts or anything along those lines. But I want to use social media, specifically Facebook, but it's 2 parts. It's this week and next. I want to talk and use and show you how sin is something that if you're not living a life of actively pursuing God, actively looking at how you walk. We're going to look at some of Paul's words tonight. Social media is a great example of how subtle sin is because of how it can trip us up without us even knowing it. That sometimes, and especially I say this quite a bit probably, I talk about Americanized Christianity because it's not necessarily true in every part of the world, but in Americanized Christianity, we have a tendency to blur what we consider to be our cultural rights, our cultural freedoms with our Christian responsibilities, and sometimes that line gets blurry, and sometimes we just do stuff because, well, everybody else is doing it. I don't know about you, but I can recall being a teenager and getting tickets as a teenager, and you try to hide them from your parents. Anybody? Just me. The DNA, for those of you that don't understand the joke, the DNA in this church is that when I teach and or preach, my illustrations, I'm the only person that's ever been through those illustrations. Because I will say, anybody else, and people go, no, I have no idea what you're, like, has anybody ever been hot before? And people go, not a clue. I don't know what that is. But when I was a teenager, true story, in the course of 1 week, I got 4 tickets and had an accident. I was 16. And my dad called me out on it on the day that my brother brought what are now his in-laws, but he had just asked, or he was getting ready to ask his girlfriend at the time to marry him, and he decided it'd be a good time to get the families together, so her family drove in, and they came to our house for dinner, and Ron wanted, this is my older brother, he wanted the 2 families to kind of meet, so we had this big Sunday dinner, and it was at that dinner that I still to this day don't even know what I said, but somehow my dad clued in that I had had a rough week driving, and in front of the whole thing, my dad said, how many tickets did you get this week? And I was like, what? I'm 16. I'm like, what? What do you mean? He's like, how many tickets did you get this week? And he said, how many? And I said, 4. And then my mom's like, yay! And my dad's like, we're going to talk in the kitchen. And I'm like, after dinner, we've got these are his possible in-laws. And it was just a nightmare. But it was that classic excuse where my dad would say, what were you doing driving so fast? And I would have the answer. I would say something along the lines of I was going with the flow of traffic. You ever use that illustration? Have you ever used that excuse? I was going with the flow of traffic. As if, and of course you guys, when you're 16, your dad's response is the classic response is just because it's the classic, if they jump off the Golden Gate, I'm like, we don't even live in California. Why is it the Golden Gate Bridge? Which would be the Chesapeake. Different story. But it's that if they jump off a cliff, will you? Those are the kinds of things. And it was this notion of just because that's what everybody else is doing doesn't it doesn't make it right. But we think that, we still to this day, as grown adults, I still do it. If the traffic is driving at a certain pace, at a certain speed, or whatever the case is, we think, well, then it's okay for me because there's 8 other cars, we're all going the same speed. But it's not, is it? Just because the entire group is doing it doesn't mean that it's okay for us. And so as Christians, there are things culturally that we do sometimes that still violate God's principles of purity and of holiness, but we assume that because it's acceptable in Americanized culture, we kind of think it's okay. And I want to use, and again, I'm just using social media as an illustration. There's a number of areas where we violate God's principles without realizing it like this, because the culture tells us it's okay, or because the culture largely says it's acceptable, or whatever the case is. And in our culture, with democracy and capitalism and all the other things that kind of infiltrate us since birth, sometimes we just don't even bother to ask, well, what do the scriptures say about this? And so I want to that's how we're launching tonight. So again, we're using Facebook, we're using social media as an illustration. I'm saying this up front because I want to make sure we get this. I'm using it as the illustration, but the topic, the takeaway is for us to understand the subtlety of sin, the subtlety of it, how easily it finds its way into our life if we're not actively understanding that. And to do that, I want to start with where God kind of first starts talking about this in the text of Genesis. Everybody knows the story of Cain and Abel, famous story. Cain and Abel. Abel is a shepherd of sorts, livestock. Cain is a farmer. He's got grains and fruits, and they bring their offerings before God. And we know that Abel brings the best, Cain brings some, and God is ultimately displeased with the offering that Cain brings. And then there's this discourse that Moses, that's who I hold as the author of the original Pentateuch, the original 5 books, but the discourse between God and between Cain is such a powerful discourse that illuminates some things ultimately about sin, especially because this is one of the earliest accounts where God talks about sin. Granted, he's already spoken with Adam and Eve regarding their rebellion, but there's things that God says in this passage that kind of illuminate some things we should understand. So I want to actually look at three of them. There's three key things when we look at Genesis 4, 3 through 7, that I want to point to. And the first is that twice there is this expression where God talks about Cain having a downcast expression. I've said this before. Anytime something is repeated in the scriptures, and there's another passage later tonight, I want to show this example to you again, but anytime both Hebrew, Aramaic, or I say both, all the original languages in the scriptures, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, use the same kind of tool where when there is repetition like this, there's importance behind it. Expression is downcast. Expression is downcast. And if you were to use the NET, because I consistently refer back to that as a powerful study Bible, it's not the only Bible that you have to use. It's not, like I said last week in our less practical illustration last week, there is no anointed illustration. But if you were to use the NET in a study process and look at the footnote behind this, you'll notice it, and I've actually got the text for you there on your right. No, your left. I get it wrong all the time. I look behind you as a mirror image, so that's why I get it wrong. But if you were to pull up the notes from the NET, you would see where it talks about the literal translation of the Hebrew, which is that his face fell, that there's this concept of the facial expression. And what's interesting to that is that all throughout the Old Testament, there is this contrast in the language between sin causes downcast, but then there is this complete opposite, and it's found multiple places in the Old Testament where when God shines upon somebody, or when somebody is found to be in right standing for the Lord, and I'm using an example here of Job 22:6, it talks about the face being lifted up. And there's intentionality behind this, that there is the connection being made. And the reason that the illustration is of a face being downcast is because it's intended to show how sin degrades. Sin has an emotional, a behavioral, a psychological impact on the human person. That when there is wrongdoing, when there is violation of God, that when life is not being lived according to the blueprint of God, there is a degradation of it. It is a downcast, as opposed to when a person is in right standing with the Lord, or when the Lord is repairing or restoring or shining upon a person, there is this talk of the countenance coming, that there is a lifting up, and it's intentional on those ends. And so twice it talks about how because of Cain's sin, his expression is downcast. And it's important because we're going to make a point about this in a little bit later, but there is a behavioral destruction. There is a psychological destruction. There is an emotional destruction. There is a depressive element upon the human being when sin is introduced. His expression is downcast. The second thing I want you to see in this passage is not just that connection, but is how God himself describes how sin operates. This is God himself talking with Cain. And he tells him that sin crouches at the door, lying in wait for you. It desires to dominate you. And that language, crouching, and if you've ever heard it, it's not inaccurate. People have described it that the reason it's crouching is that there's this, it's intentionally, it's an animal-like imagery, and people always attach it to lions or cats. And if you've ever played with a cat with a laser pointer, nobody does that, only I do that. If you ever do the little, or if you put down we grew up with cats. I don't have cats now, I just have a dog, but we grew up with cats, and we did the classic, put the grocery bag and tap the back of it, tap, 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 and the cat starts the, that kind of a thing. You'll never see that from me again. But it's that crouching. And that's an accurate illustration, but there's another part of the definition that I don't always hear talked about where, and again, to just kind of connect to last week. So last week, if you weren't here, if you haven't watched it yet, highly practical lesson last week about how to use online Bible study tools to kind of research things on your own. And one of the sites I noted for you last week was blueletterbible.org. You can go there and look at the meaning of any word that you want and get any given passage. So I'm not going to call up the live sites tonight, but I've gone ahead and pulled the definitions out. So I went to the website, and if you look at the Hebrew behind crouching at the door, it talks about stretching out, lying out, not necessarily the crouching ready to pounce. And again, like I said, that's not an inaccurate, but it more literally is this stretching out, lying out. And if you look at the very bottom of the definition, it actually talks about stalling or waiting. that it's still an animal imagery, but it's this notion that I want you to see the imagery that God says that sin crouches where? At the door. In other words, that he likens sin to an animal that places itself where it knows you're going to go through. We all go through the door. I don't know about you. I have a dog that psychologically, that dog has figured out that the way the dog does not get left out of walks or going outside. I mean, even if I'm going to get the mail, the dog wants to go. It's, yeah, where are we going? We're going to, and the dog has, especially when I take the dog over to my mother's house, if we're going on vacation and my mother's going to watch the dog, I will go over, take the dog with us, and the dog knows something's up. I say the dog, I'm talking, it's Margot, it's my girl. She knows something's up when we go over there. So I will go in and I will sit down and be talking with my mom 5 or 10 minutes. We're about to leave for vacation and Margot's there. And she knows that she's about to get left. And so it's every time, it's so interesting. She will not come and sit by me. She will go and sit at the door because she knows I have to go through there. And so she'll play, and she does it at her house too, when it's the mail. She places herself instinctively where she knows I'm going to come. And if I wait too long, then she just does this clunk, and we have one, it's a golden retriever. We have one of those things where you walk in the door and you're like, hey, I'm home, Mark, go. And you're doing this kind of a thing to step over the dog. That the imagery is that God says that sin doesn't just crouch, but it intentionally places itself in wait for you. The reason that lying or stretching out is important is because it's willing to wait as long as it needs to. I'll just wait here. I will wait for you to come this way. It's there, and again, this is God's imagery of how sin works. He's talking to Cain, but we should read this. It'll wait as long as it needs to. Just wait. It waits in pathways that it knows that we walk, and it waits intentionally, lying, stretching. If you want to use the crouching, that works too. And it will wait as long as it needs to. And it will wait along the pathways that it knows that you and I walk. And again, look at the attitude of it. God says it has a desire to dominate you. You are its prey. It's the predator. You're the prey. It will place itself along your pathways of life, and it will wait for you. The third thing that I want you to see in here before we look at Paul's instructions about this, the third thing is the notion that God says this. He doesn't talk about sin just coming after you blindly. He doesn't just talk about sin coming after you and catching you off guard. People love to do that all the time. People like to talk about sin and about Satan as if it somehow caught them off guard. It surprised them. It overtook them, or whatever the case is. But it's interesting what God says here is he tells Cain this. He says, look, in spite of how sin works, he says this. He says, but if you do right, you're fine. If you do right, you're fine. It's if you do not do what is right that you have to worry. You catch that? That it's not that sin has the power to overtake you. It's not that sin has the power to just destroy you and you go, I was just a passive victim. No. There is this component where it's dependent upon us to walk correctly and make sure that we're aware of this. I use the illustration, I paired it to the New Testament to show you that this concept has not changed from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant, because James says in James 1:14-15, he says, each one is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desires. Then when desire conceives, sin can take over. It doesn't start with sin, it starts with you messing up. Same thing back in Genesis. God says, look, if you do right, you're fine. You don't have to worry about where the animal's laying. You don't have to worry about where it has stretched itself out, waiting to pounce on you when you come through. If you do what is right, you're okay. It's if you don't do what is right that you have to worry. And that's one of the earliest instructions about how we're supposed to walk in our relationship to God and in our concern regarding sin. You follow with me? The reason I do so much of a laborious kind of look into Genesis 4 is because I want you to see the instructions that Paul gives in Ephesians 5:15. He makes this statement. He says, consider carefully how you live. And again, I'm going to keep pointing back to the lesson last week, because if you use some of the practical illustration we talked about last week, if you were to look at the notes, if you were to just do a little bit of study, 60 seconds, 2 minutes, on that word live, you'd see that the actual translation is consider carefully how you walk. Consider carefully how you walk. Look where you step. Put those two illustrations together. God talks about sin as this animal-like predator that stretches itself out in the pathways of life that it knows you're going to go through, the doorways you're going to walk through. And our answer to that is that we're supposed to do what is right. We're supposed to watch where we're stepping. We're supposed to watch where we're walking. You follow? Stay with the animal. Margot will go upstairs, our dog again. She'll go upstairs when my wife goes upstairs. I'm a night owl. My brain just starts clicking around 9 o'clock. My wife is dead to the world by 9 o'clock. So we watch a movie, watch TV, family time together, 9 o'clock, 9:30. My wife's like, I'm out. And it's good night. Make sure Kyle's ready for bed. And she's gone. She's out. And Margot's like, this is awesome. I'm going to bed every night. It's like a new thing. Going to bed. And so she goes with my wife, and she'll lay in the floor somewhere, and all the lights are off. And so when I come upstairs, the room is pitch black, and I know that Margot's in there somewhere. And I've made enough mistakes where everything explodes. So I walk in, and I don't want to turn the lights on, but I'm doing this kind of like, I'm waiting for my eyes to adjust, and I'm doing you know what I'm talking about. You get it as well. You know what it's like to, I've talked about it before. I've used this illustration before, that it's also similar to when you break a glass in your kitchen. No one's ever done that, just me. Again, illustrations. I'm the only one that walks through these things in life. But you break glass, and especially if it's in the summer and you're in bare feet in your kitchen, and if a glass shatters, suddenly it's like everybody freeze, right? No one step, and then it's just kind of like you're putting your head down to see if you can get where the light is reflecting, and then it becomes this kind of like, Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark kind of a thing, where it's watch carefully how you walk. Watch carefully how you walk. So catch that, both of those verses together. God in Genesis 4 says sin lies itself out, stretches out. It's willing to wait as long as it needs to, and it puts itself right in the pathways and the doorways that it knows you're coming. It wants to wait. It wants to dominate you. All you have to do is just do what is right, and you'll be fine. Paul in the New Testament says, watch carefully where you're stepping. Watch carefully where you're walking. Look, consider. And I think it's this last one when it comes to the reason I think sin is subtle in of its own. Genesis 4, 3 through 7 shows us that subtlety. It lies in wait, ready to pounce. It's subtle. But the reason it's subtle in our lives isn't just because sin is powerful, but because I don't think that we necessarily always do that watch carefully part. I think we just kind of walk through going, I'm a Christian, God's grace will cover me, and this is where I talk about the blending we think in America, that we just think I've got certain rights and God loves America, and so we don't really think about watching carefully, but there's places where we step, and sometimes we may not even know that we've tripped and sinned in the process because, everybody's doing it. So that's where we're going to jump into this concept of social media. I want to talk tonight, and again, it's illustrative. I'm using Facebook as the illustration. There's a ton of places we can make application here. But I want to show you how Facebook, specifically Facebook tonight, has the ability to introduce envy into where you can trip over envy. It can lie at the door waiting for you, ready to pounce, ready to dominate. And if you're not watching carefully, you will step into it full force, and envy will make its way into your heart, and you have already missed the mark. The aim has been lost without you even sometimes knowing it because you weren't carefully walking. You're going, social media, everybody has that. We don't even think about the implications of how today's tech world has attached this to our bodies. Every single person in this room probably has a phone. Every single person in this room. Think about how recent this kind of an advancement was. When I was a kid anyway, where was the phone? It's on the wall with a cord. Anybody? Now again, it's just me. We had the phone in the kitchen on the wall with the really long cord. And you take it off and dangle it and turn it. And the reason it got twisted is because when you're on it for a long time, you were kind of doing this. And you'd talk, and it would wrap around your legs, and then you would do this and go back. And that was the phone, and it rang, you answered it. And you never, ever picked it up when it was dinner. If it rang during dinner or TV or whatever, you went, we'll get it later, right? It's not that important. And you didn't stress or obsess during the course of the day going, I wonder if anybody's calling me today. But the world, the culture, the same way that out on the road, the flow of traffic can just kind of go from 55 to 70 without you even batting an eye, the world around us does things to us, and we just go, well, because everybody else is doing it, we don't even think to ask, is there any implications behind this spiritually? We just go, yeah, I got a phone. Everybody has a phone. It's what we kind of do. Social media, everybody's on social media, so everybody's doing it, and we're not watching carefully how we walk, and things can happen. One of my first inclinations to the notion of the evilness of social media. I've always kind of been a suspect of it, but in the corporate world, I was neck deep in social media because this is what I helped corporations ultimately figure out what to do, was how to build social media marketing plans and measuring social media and the analytics and the market research, is doing what was considered to be social listening, which is their software that's able to scrape social media posts, and then you can figure out what consumers are talking about. And I was sitting with my team out in coffee one day, and my team, there was an obvious, I'm an old dude. I'm 50, not that old. Relative to here, I'm not that old. And my team, they were all born like in the 2000s, it was gross, So I'd have a team of all these millennials, and we'd sit down and go, when were you born? And they'd be like, I was born in 2001. And I was like, I graduated high school in 89. They're kids. And we were just talking about some social media plans for one of our clients. And I was talking about Facebook, and they were like, they shouldn't even be on Facebook. And I'm like, are you kidding? I was like, do you know the power and the influence of Facebook? And I went, well, you got, and they're like, we don't use it at all. And so you got the millennial group, and they're my team. They're my research team in social media. They're only on Facebook because they know the clients have it, but they go, we don't even use it. And I was like, why don't you guys use it? And they said, that's just where old people humble brag. And I went, okay, hey, who's old? And one of my guys, great guy, young guy, he was only 20 years old, same conversation. We were talking through this, and he said, no, he goes, you don't understand, Lane. He said, I respect you, man. He said, I really, really respect you. I said, okay, but why are you putting so much emphasis on it? He goes, because he said, you know so much about tech, and you've stayed so sharp with it. He goes, and my dad can't operate anything, but you stayed sharp with it. And we just stared at each other. And my right hand, she was also millennial, but I looked over and she goes, he's calling you old, right? And I said, I got that. But they said Facebook is where old people humble brag. And for them, old was anything above 35. And I said, what's a humble brag? And they said a humble brag is where you talk as if you're being humble, where you post as if it's humility. They say you may compliment somebody else, you may give a compliment to somebody, you may post pictures of friends and talk about how much you love them, but really you're the one in the center of the photo. You really are it's a brag. It's humble, but it's a brag. And that's an actual millennial term in social media. It's a humble brag, where you are writing as if you are humble, but really you're trying to. And I said, that's how you view it? They said, yeah, that's all it is. It's just people who are just trying to say, look at my life, look at my life, look at my life. And they said, because they know everybody else is actually looking at your life. And I was thinking, you guys really, and so we started doing some research behind that. And I said, how much of that is actually true? Because I was curious as to whether or not we could work that angle actually into some of the marketing plans and kind of come up with some strategies behind that. And some of the research that we went to, I just want to share with you a couple of small stats. We're not going to go through a book of it all, but just consider some of the stats behind it. Around 69% of adults use Facebook. 7 in 10 do so every single day. 49% of that number visit the site several times a day. I have hours behind that too, and it's just sick when you consider social media as a whole, not just Facebook. This is just Facebook alone, but when you consider social media as a whole, it's just sick how much time we're putting into it. Just a couple of other stats here. A 2015 study showed that spending time on Facebook viewing other people's posts without interacting, meaning just passively scrolling through, actually increases your chance of developing social anxiety. I don't know how big the graphic is over here, but you can see the highlights of the study. Greater social anxiety symptoms were associated with more times. The more time you put on Facebook, as these research firms did their studies, they noted a positive correlation between the more time you put on Facebook, the higher your social anxiety. Think about that. Just scrolling, not fighting, not arguing, not political inroads of this, that. Just simply looking at other people's lives increases social anxiety in the process. Another study surveyed 425 Facebook users and found that individuals who possessed a Facebook account over a longer period, i.e. several years, tended to perceive that others are happier and life is unfair. Moreover, individuals who spent more hours per week and those who befriended strangers, meaning not actual close friends, but just long, distant other people, were more likely to believe that others on Facebook had better lives than they did. An actual excerpt from this study says that participants who browsed their Facebook newsfeed reported lower state self-esteem and higher depression, there's countenance falling, than participants who browsed a non-social content Facebook page, like a group where you were just talking about content from a class or something, where they're talking about the news feed where you see other people's lives. The results revealed a moderation effect for general social comparison tendency. Social comparison tendency. These findings point to a causal link between exposure to social content presented on Facebook and negative psychological outcomes. And I have news for you. I had a video clip I was going to show tonight, but I just was running out of time and trying to pull it together. But I have a video clip where Sean Parker, one of the founders of Facebook, alongside of Mark Zuckerberg and Eduardo Savin and some of the others, but Sean Parker, a video clip of him from 4 years ago where he was saying that they knew from the start when they were coding and developing Facebook how they were intentionally going and building it on an addictive model to get people to feel dissatisfied so they'd keep coming back. They knew that from the beginning. It was designed with that. That's why the likes are in there. That's why Facebook chose to create this kind of dopamine kind of click effect thing as opposed to just giving you photos. Because think about this. Again, when I grew up, if you went over to someone's house and they said, "Do you want to see my vacation photos?" You said, "Not on your life." They'd have like a stack of photos, or they'd have the carousel reel with the slides in it. You know, my Uncle Paul, our former Ranger commander here, he was huge on the slides in the carousel. He'd be like, "Do you want to see that?" No! I have zero interest in your vacation. I wasn't there and I didn't go and I don't want to see it. But Facebook switched all of that. Now we're like, I got to see what they were doing. What'd they buy? What'd they eat? Where'd they go? How did they get the money for that? Because I didn't think she was even working. And now she's at Disney for the fourth time. How is that even? You know, and we start and scroll. Gotta know. A negative effect on countenance. Facebook is a source of envy. You can actually diagnose or self-diagnose envy on WebMD. You go on WebMD, you go to the website, you go, do I have envy? Am I wrestling with signs of jealousy? And you can see some of the symptoms there. It says that you are suffering from envy if you're not happy for others when they achieve success, or if another person's success makes you feel unhappy, or if you feel the need to diminish someone else's success. If you judge others negatively, nobody ever does that. Or you're happy when others face setbacks. Now, you wouldn't admit that. They post on Facebook, this or this, and you're like, I'm so sorry, I'm praying for you. But you inside, you sense something sinister of this kind of like, sure, you know. And there's a quote, interestingly, this is WebMD. They have as a footnote on the diagnosis of envy this. They have a footnote that says the rise of social media has been documented to trigger envy and lower mental well-being in some people. As friends post pictures of their best moments in life, it can trigger feelings of inadequacy or regret in others. What are we doing with this thing? Again, I'm not trying to in any way, shape, or form. Tonight's message is not get rid of Facebook. Tonight's message is about the subtlety of, but we use social media and we use tech not because we've investigated it, not because we've asked the question, does this hurt or help my spiritual life? Not because we don't actually do the step or watch carefully. We just go, everybody's on it. Everybody does it. Everybody has a phone. I'll do it. And so we just kind of blindly step into some things. But the research shows that constant use of it has the ability to increase anxiety, increase depression, raise levels of regret. And we're all human, so we all get affected kind of the same way in the process of this. How about this? This is going to be a fast one, but let me just kind of go through it. How does Facebook, when it influences envy, how does it affect marriage lives? It's disastrous. A study published in the Journal of Cyber Psychology, Behavior, and Social Networking found that people who use Facebook more than once an hour are more likely to experience Facebook-related conflict with their romantic partners. It gets worse. Approximately 1 in 3 divorces have resulted from social media-related disagreements. Similarly, a 2010 survey by the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers, who knew there was such a thing, the AAML, found that 4 out of 5 lawyers used evidence derived from social networking sites in divorce cases, and Facebook leads that pack. In many instances, a correlation was found, get this, in many instances of the arguments and fights and disagreements and ultimately divorces, a correlation was found to stem from jealousy and arguments about past partners related to social media snooping. In other words, if you don't know what that means, it means people use Facebook to go find their old girlfriends and old boyfriends. And your current spouse doesn't find that attractive. Imagine that. But we do it because everybody, we're just friends. We're just friends. Because the word friend is so generic. Now, you would never in a million years send out an FBI agent to find that person and get their number and then call them and have a but on Facebook, we just friended each other. And then the other goes, who's this person? Who's this person? And you go, think about this for just a second. 30% of Tinder users, Tinder's not Facebook related, Tinder is just a different kind of social media app that is intentionally made for matchmaking. 30% of users on Tinder are actually married. I guarantee you this, they're not looking to see if they have a positive match with their current spouse. Well, let's just go in here and see I just want to see if I match to you. 16% of married couples admitted their use of Facebook has caused significant jealousy in their marriage due to connections to other people and past partners. Finally, research has also found that a 20% annual increase in Facebook enrollment was directly associated with a 2 to 4% increase in divorce rates. You kind of getting the... And again, the point isn't, social media bad. The point is not, tech bad. The question is what Paul said in Ephesians 5. The question is when you use tech, when you use social media, do you watch carefully how you walk? Or do you just go, everybody has it, everybody does it, everybody friends their former girlfriends, their former boyfriends, everybody. And if you're not watching carefully, sin goes, that's what I want. Because sin, especially envy, jealousy, just lies at the door going, scroll through that thing. I'll wait here as long as I need to. Just keep scrolling. And when that picture comes, when that post comes, pounces. Why? Because what did God tell Cain? It desires to dominate us. That's its goal. That's its plan. In the process. So, going through all that kind of research, my question is there a hazard? That if we were to say, okay, I will watch carefully how I walk. I will investigate social media and the utilization of social media. I will investigate it in the light of the scriptures because I don't want to trip over sin. I don't want to trip over envy. I don't want jealousy to find its place in my heart. I don't want to miss the mark because envy has found its way in me. I don't want to be angry at other people's successes. I don't want to be angry at other people's whatever the case. I don't want to start judging people because I think they're living outside their means or I don't want to do that. So if we were to watch carefully how we walk, how might we consider this when it comes to the scriptures? Here's the first thing we would consider. I said we forget. Probably should have written it as we shouldn't forget. But part of the problem, part of the reason that we trip over sin at the door and it finds its way into our heart is because we forget that sin has an ability to blind us to our own issues when we're focused on other people. That's not me saying that. Remember what Jesus said. Jesus was talking to his audience, to the people around him, to his disciples, and he said, why do you see the speck in your brother's eye but fail to see the beam of wood in your own? Or how can you say to your brother, well, let me remove the speck from your eye while there's a beam in your own? You hypocrite. First remove the beam from your own eye, and then you can see clearly remove the speck from your others. Let me ask you a question. How many times did the word speck and beam just happen in that? 3 times each. Remember what I said at the beginning about repetition? He says it over. Speck and beam, speck and beam, speck and beam. And that if you were to use the NET and to look at these instances and pull out the notes, again, you don't really need to study notes because there's no secret to the original languages, but just to kind of show you the contrast between the two is that the Greek word for speck is talking to this incredibly small piece of wood, splinter. Whereas beam is talking to like the size of a plank that you would build a ship with. And Jesus' point is that when you are focused on somebody else's issues, when you turn your attention to other people's issues, to other people's problems, when you put it and you start, that what sin does is sin uses that opportunity to blind you to the gargantuan problems in your own life. And social media, Facebook especially, has a tendency to draw our attention towards others. And by virtue of Jesus' own teaching, when we're focused on others, we're blind towards our own. And it can happen two different ways. You could be angry with what someone has posted. You could be angry with how someone's living their life. You could be in disapproval of how someone's living their life. But it can also go the other way too. You could see, and this is what, remember we said when we looked at the definition of envy inside of MD, it said that there is a satisfaction with another person's misfortune. Again, it's not something you would ever admit openly. You would never tell somebody else, yes, I actually felt satisfaction in their misfortune. But sin has the ability to put that into our heart and where we sense it, we feel it. We're kind of glad that it failed. We're kind of glad they didn't get forward. We're kind of glad they didn't move. Not because we hate them, but because it makes us feel better about ourselves. And there's a tendency to look at somebody else's misfortune or whatever, or maybe it's even their fortune. They get promoted and we think, they got promoted, but not as far as I've gone. We see that they got something new, a new car, and they go, well, that's nice of them. Mine's better. And you don't have to, sin does not wait for you to actively think that. Sin just finds it lies at the door and just puts itself in you. The thought can happen in your brain before you even know how it got there. And you go, wait, what am I doing? I'm actually glorifying the fact that I have a better, whatever the case, better car, better job, better life, better. And you don't even realize that, according to Jesus' teachings, that when you're focused, when you're spending your time focused on other people's lives, scroll, you are becoming blinded to the issues of your own. And Jesus' instructions are, deal with your own stuff first. Deal with your own stuff. If you really are concerned about somebody else's life, if you really want to, deal with yours first and then go back. But we don't do that. When it comes to social media, we just think, well, it's just an app. It's just an app on my phone. It's not just an app on your phone. It's a behavior. It's an appetite. It's a process. You follow with me? You're not coming back next week. Number 2, worry, anxiety, or concern over your life or possessions is a loss of focus on the overall kingdom. Remember, we just said that people who look at Facebook, that research has shown that it increases anxiety, and that people that use Facebook for a prolonged period of time begin to get a general sense of unhappiness with their life because they think everybody else's is so much better. When the reality is that everybody else is only posting the good stuff. Nobody's posting the bad stuff. Nobody's posting going, I just got fired for incompetence. Nobody's posting, they just repossessed my car because I couldn't make the payment. No one's putting that stuff. We're only putting the good stuff on there. And so other people, when I say other people, when we see that, we get a general sense of anxiety that our life isn't measuring up. How did they get that car? And it's not that we're mad that they got a car, but we have been wrestling with our own bills and we know we need a new car. And we're going, but I don't even know how I would ever even afford it. I couldn't ever make that. How did they do it? How did they afford a vacation to Italy? I can't even get to King's Dominion. Those kinds of things come up. But remember what Jesus taught. He said, don't worry about your life, what you'll eat, you'll drink, your body, what you'll wear. Isn't there more to life than these kinds of things? We forget these things. This kind of instruction from Jesus tells us how to carefully walk. And that every single time you open the app, you should remind yourself, I will look to the Lord for my life. He is my supplier. What I have or what I don't have, that is something I will take up with him. I'm not going to take it up with the social media community. You with me? The phrase, do not worry, if you were to do a word study, Blue Letter Bible, Bible Gateway, whatever, the phrase, the actual Greek word is better translated as don't be anxious. I love that. Don't be anxious about your life. And compare that language of Matthew 6:25. I tell you, do not be anxious about your life. Compare that to the highlights of this study that says greater social anxiety the more time on Facebook. Jesus says, don't have anxiety about your life, what you'll wear, where you go, what you'll do. And yet the study says that Facebook increases anxiety about life, what you have, what you own, where you're going. See the direct contrast? And again, we're using this as an illustration on how sin is subtle. That's the point of tonight's lesson, how subtle sin is. That in simply accepting the culture's values, we should carry the phone around. And simply, everybody does this. We introduce it into our life, and before we even know it, envy and jealousy, which was lying at the door, jumped into our heart and into our spirit, into our soul, and now we're infected with it because we were just walking carelessly as opposed to watching carefully how we should walk. It's that subtle. It's that easy. You say, man, Lane, you're making it really, it just sounds so... No, that's how God, remember, Genesis 4, that's how God described it to Cain. It lies at the door and it waits and it wants to dominate you. And listen, Cain, if you do what's right, you're fine. You don't have... It's when you do what is wrong. And the subtlety of sin is sin takes opportunity when we do things that are wrong that we don't even know are wrong because, well, that's just what the culture does. Social media, Facebook, just one example we're using tonight. There's so many different ways where you could say, yeah, I'm living my life this way because that's just how I didn't even think to evaluate it according to how the scriptures tell me I should think about this. And we do it with our finances, with our pursuit of success, with business ownership, there's so many areas of life where you could say, I need to start thinking in terms of scripture's guidance because sin is so subtle and I need to have an attitude that understands it like the animal carefully waiting, just waiting for me to step and trip over it. Here's the third. I said envy has the potential to drive us into some really dark places. And I want you to remember we said this from the very beginning, we called this missing the mark because of the definition of sin. Hamartia was the Greek word that we said that just the slightest error in aim results in greater and greater distance from the mark the further you go. The smallest amount of envy over time, the smallest amount can carry people into really dark places. I shared, I think it was last week, forgive me if it was either last week or the week before, but I shared with you how the Wall Street Journal uncovered the reports from Facebook's own internal data scientists that Instagram was directly attached to suicide rates among young teenage girls because of body image. That's a dark place. When you're sick, when you're 50, when you're our ages, we're sitting here tonight, the majority of us here is older adults, and we're hearing this, we have the capacity, because we're adults, or at least I hope we have the capacity to go, you know what, I need to consider this. I need to consider my image in front of God. I need to consider what the scriptures say. I need to take a more approach to how I handle these things, and I need to, but when you're 16 and you start developing negative social anxieties about your body, what do? You take your life. It carries us into dark places. I want to show you a passage here that maybe, I don't know if you've ever seen this before, but it's a very rare occurrence of the word. It's actually the only occurrence of the word in the Gospels. The word envy only occurs in the Gospels in this one location. In Matthew, Mark has the exact same story, but Matthew and Mark, they're telling the same story. So it occurs once in Matthew, once in Mark, but it's the same story. It's the only occurrence of the word envy in the Gospels. And it's the narrative accounting of Pilate's decisions about how he's going to deal with Jesus. The religious leaders have brought Jesus to him. And Pilate, he's not really the evil guy in the story. It's the religious leaders that are the enemy in the story, Satan obviously, but Pilate just doesn't even want to be bothered. When you look at the historical, he doesn't even want to be in Jerusalem. He has no desire to be in what he considers to be just the armpit of the Middle East. He does not want to be in Jerusalem. He does not want to be there. But when you're doing political ladder climbing, when you're looking for your sites to go forward, then wherever you got position or wherever your station is, so Pilate's put here, and they bring him, that they're all complaining. There is this uprising inside of Jerusalem about this religious leader who's claiming to be the Messiah, and they don't want to put him to death themselves, and so they bring him to Pilate and go, we'll let the Roman government do this, and what we'll do is we'll say to the Roman government, this guy's claiming to be king, and we'll let Pilate deal with that, because Pilate knows that if word gets its way back to Rome, and if Caesar hears about this, then his head's on the block, and so there's all these little inroads and strategies, and they bring him to Pilate, and Pilate's mindset is not, I want to crucify Jesus. Pilate's mindset is, and he comes up with a plan. There is a law that they have, there's a ritual that they have where they can, at the time of the festivals that are taking place in Passover, there's a time where they can release, kind of pardon, the way that when we have, it's a ritual similar to when our presidents finish their 4-year term, there is kind of like a bunch of pardons that take place, that the president will deliver pardons to prisoners as kind of like this, goodwill gesture, that he'll do. And so kind of the same thing. It was this notion of that let the crowd decide. And so Pilate goes, I got this. Pilate goes, this is easy. He goes, I will go get this hardened dude Barabbas, this cold-blooded criminal that deserves death, and I will put him against it. And his point was, and Pilate says this in a different part of the story, Pilate made the claim to the people that he could find nothing wrong with Jesus. He hadn't violated anything. He hadn't broken any laws. In Pilate's mindset, the guy was just a little bit of a crazy religious lunatic that was walking around claiming to be the Messiah, but that wasn't novel. There were other people that had claimed to be the Messiah. And so he says, he can't find anything wrong with Jesus, so he makes this concept, and he says, I know what I'll do. I will expose them. He wants to expose the Pharisees. He wants to expose their own hypocrisy, and it's written in here, and I want you to notice this because it's parenthetical. What that means is that Matthew added this to the text for clarity for the reader. That Matthew wanted us, the readers, Matthew wants us to know something about Pilate, and he says that they brought Jesus Barabbas, his name. So after they had assembled, Pilate said to them, look, who do you want me to release for you? And Pilate knows what he's doing, and that's the reason Matthew gives us the parenthetical statement. Pilate says, who do you want me to release for you? You want Barabbas, or do you want this one that claims to be the Christ? And Matthew writes in there that Pilate knew what they were up to. He says Pilate knew that they had brought him to them because of envy. In other words, that Pilate saw through it. Pilate saw that the Pharisees didn't really have anything on Jesus. Jesus had not really violated anything. Jesus had not really not anywhere near what Barabbas had done. It would be like saying, hey, this guy broke the speed limit a couple of times in his car, and here's Charles Manson. Which one do you want? The logical choice is going to be like, well, we can't obviously say let Charles Manson go over the... It was kind of that. Pilate's intentionally trying to call them out. He's trying to expose them because he knows that the only problem in the audience is that they are envious of the popularity and the power and the authority and the audiences that Jesus is getting. Nobody's showing up at synagogue anymore. Nobody's following them anymore. Nobody's partying in the streets as they walk down. But when Jesus comes, man, there's just this flock going after this guy, man. He's not a religious leader. He's not a religious expert. He's not going. He's a carpenter's son. But man, the crowds that are going. And if he's out in the hillside, they go out to see him. They're not any longer coming to sit at the feet. And there's anger and there's jealousy. And Matthew says that Pilate knew it was just simply envy is all it was. Envy carries us to dark places. It caused them to take Jesus for crucifixion. And it causes us to also hate people. And it can start small, but it grows. Oh, I thought I had James's passage up there. Maybe it's after this. I may have lost it. Here's the last one. Let's not forget that the scriptures simply call us to be on our guard against envy, jealousy, and coveting. If 1, 2, 3, if the first three don't hit you, then let's just take the most basic. Point 4 is that we're supposed to be on our guard against envy anyway. Oh, here's the James passage. We've used this in our Clean series on Sunday, both the first part 2 weeks ago and then this last week, we've referenced this passage. Remember what James says. He says, where do conflicts and where do quarrels among you come from? Is it not from this? And this is a redundant question. From your passions that battle inside of you? You desire, you can't have. You murder and envy. You murder and you envy. You murder and you envy, and you cannot obtain. You quarrel and fight. You do not have because you don't ask, and even when you do, you don't get it because you're only looking to spend it on your own pleasures. It's that envy and jealousy. It can start so small, and then it just grows in anger and hatred, and it's a dangerous thing. It's one of the 7 deadly sins. Envy. But because we don't watch where we're walking carefully, the simple use of something as innocuous, or so we think, of social media can introduce it into our hearts and our souls and our spirits. Not to mention the fact that one of the original commandments from God back under the Old Covenant, one of the original 10 commandments, was that you're not supposed to covet your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, their servant, male, female, their ox, their donkey, or anything. One of the 10 commandments tells us that we are not supposed to look upon our neighbor's possessions of any sort, their life, their advancements, and covet or be envious. One of the original 10 commandments. And yet, studies and research shows that social media powerfully places that in our heart, whether we realize it or not. Why? Because sin is subtle. And so the takeaway, and like I said, there's two parts to this. This is the first part about the subtlety of sin. And then I want to talk next part as well. This week is more about envy, but I want to talk about how it also introduces wrath and anger without us even trying in it as well as a second part. But the takeaway tonight is this. We're studying sin, and we've talked about the seriousness of sin. Now we're talking about the subtlety of it. And I want you to hear those words from God to Cain again, where he says, it will lie in wait for you. Sin, that is. It will lie in wait for you. It will stretch itself out at the doorway, the pathways of life that it knows you're going to walk. And however long it takes, it will lie in wait, 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 because its desire is to dominate you. So if you do right, you're okay. And the amplification of that is Paul's words in Ephesians 5. We have to be people who watch carefully how we walk. Do not do anything just because the culture does it. Don't do anything just because that's what everybody does. Oh, well, everybody has a phone. Everybody has it's not that big. It's not that big. And yet, our hearts get infected with stuff. You follow with me? Let me pray tonight and close this out. Lord, my prayer tonight is that the teaching comes across exactly how I opened it, that the concept of social media is more the illustration. There are clearly pitfalls. There are clearly places of tripwires and landmines. But the truth of the matter is, Lord, that our desire is to look at your words in Genesis 4 and to hear Paul's call in Ephesians 5 and to realize that we should be people that walk a lot more carefully than we do because of how subtle sin is, and that you would start to speak to us, that if there's any place in our lives where we have just been walking along because we think, that's just how the culture does it, that you would wake us up to that, inspire us to more time in your word, start to awaken us to these warnings and calls so that we would do exactly what you spoke to Cain, that we would do what is right, and that these things would no longer be things we have to fear. We pray for just your guidance in that. In Jesus' name, everybody said, amen. God bless you guys. We'll see you this Sunday.